Farmers in India are angry and protesting controversial new laws they say threaten their livelihoods, and it's big corporations who will benefit. Prime Minister Narendra Modi says change is needed, but as protests intensify, what will he do? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. For the past 3 weeks, tens of thousands of Indian farmers have been protesting against new agricultural laws. They say the changes will hurt their livelihoods by making them vulnerable to big corporations. But the government insists the regulation of the industry is badly needed. Police say at least 25 people have died, several of them from cold weather, as farmers continue to block highways and camp on the outskirts of New Delhi. On Friday, Prime Minister Narendra Modi offered to hold further talks as weeks of negotiations have failed to reach a compromise. Modi says the farmers are being exploited by opposition parties, which he says supported the new laws when they held government.
I just want ease in the life of farmers. I want their progress and want modernity in the agriculture sector. Political parties should stop misguiding farmers. It's been over 6 to 7 months since the farm laws were implemented. But now, suddenly, games are being played to plough one's political land through a web of lies.
Al Jazeera's Elizabeth Purnam has the latest from the Indian capital, New Delhi.
Prime Minister Modi said that everyone has been demanding reforms in the agriculture sector. He said that previous governments, that opposition parties, have been wanting to pass these same laws but haven't been able to. He said that it's those parties who are now stoking the protests and that they're jealous of him for passing laws which they weren't able to, but he doesn't want credit for the laws. He just wants to make farmers happy. He also asked opposition parties to stop using farmers for political gain. Well, that's not going to go down well with farmers. These protests have been going on for 3 weeks now. They are very much a grassroots movement and they are people-led, with tens of thousands of farmers, if not more, continuing to block 3 major highways into the Indian capital region. And this week they had some good news from the Indian Supreme Court, which was hearing petitions seeking the immediate removal of farmers, of protesters from highways. But the Supreme Court said that farmers have a right to protest as long as they're not damaging any lives or property. The Supreme Court also asked the country's Solicitor General to form a committee with farm union leaders and the government to resolve this dispute. But farmers say that they're not open to that they've had their own talks with the government. They reject the government's proposed amendments and say that nothing short of a complete repeal of the 3 farm laws will do, because they say that the laws were passed without any consultation with farmers, that they were pushed through Parliament, and that they inherently favour large corporations over farmers.
Let's introduce our panel. In Oxford, in the UK, Nikita, an Associate Professor of Development Studies at the University of Oxford. In Mumbai, Tuhin Sinha, member of the Bharatiya Janata party. Also in India, in Gurgaon, Arun Kumar, Chair Professor at the Institute of Social Sciences. Well, welcome to you all. Nikita, when you look at the laws introduced by the government about agriculture, you get the first impression that this is something that could help the farmers chart their own course, but this is not the way the farmers themselves see it.
Yes, absolutely. These laws have been in contention through much of the summer and now into the winter. The government first introduced them under the shadow of lockdown. It then took the matter to the parliament, where the opposition was not allowed to have a show of hands. The speaker insisted on a voice vote, and the opposition deeply resented this, protested this, but within Parliament or outside Parliament, the opposition to these laws has not been taken into account, which is why we have the situation on the streets right now. The farmers fear the deregulation and liberalization of agriculture with no safeguards. And the government seems to want to ram these through because it has this neoliberal model of marketization in mind.
Tuhin, do you see the impasse broken anytime soon with the Prime Minister saying, I'm moving forward with the plan, and with the farmers saying there's absolutely no way we will go for a compromise until the laws are scrapped by the government?
Well, these farm reforms were waiting to happen for the last 15 odd years, and every political party at some point of time or the other has supported it. Even the previous agriculture minister, Sharad Pawar, has supported it. The previous, the present Punjab chief minister, who belongs to the Congress, Mr. Amrinder Singh, he has supported it in the past. Now, all of the apprehensions and all of the concerns of the farmers have been addressed in a very detailed proposal given out by the government on the 9th of December. Some 10 of the issues which has been raised by them, which includes MSP, concerns about MSP pricing, which includes concerns about corporates and the private sector taking over the land, all of these have been addressed. But unfortunately, the protesting farmers have not come back for a talk. And now it's come to a point where it's a very autocratic protest where they want the farm laws to be repealed altogether. Now, we need to understand that India is in reformist mode in the same way that you can't undo all of the tax reforms which have taken place in the last 5 years. You can't undo the GST. We have a very open mind when it comes to discussion, when it comes to negotiation, when it comes to addressing the concerns of the farmers, which in fact the Prime Minister has repeatedly emphasized.
Okay.
But when it comes to my way or the highway, unfortunately the government won't give in to that kind of a pressure.
And this is exactly what we're planning to do in this program, which is basically to address some of the concerns of the farmers. Arun, I mean, in theory, why would the farmers be afraid of the notion of bypassing government-regulated markets, selling their own produce directly to the clients and dealing with private companies instead of going through middlemen?
So, we have to appreciate the fact that 86% of the farmers are rather small, cultivating less than 5 acres of land, and they don't have much of a clout. Whereas companies are large, they have lawyers, they have, various kinds of possibilities which the farmers don't have deep pockets. So in other words, it's not possible for farmers to take on the corporate sector, which may be entering the market. And the issue really is that the government says we are freeing the market and we are giving the farmers choice. But the point is that, in agriculture, there's nothing like freeing the markets. Because, the produce market, when you produce something, you are in debt, and therefore you have to return that, the money that you've borrowed, and therefore you don't have a choice. So in a sense, there is nothing like a free market that can operate in agriculture. And, the choice to the small farmers is not possible. So this notion that, we are giving the farmers greater choice, they will benefit out of it. The farmers don't see it that way. What they see is that, they were hurting badly even before the laws were brought in because, of the fact that they were not getting the price, the minimum support price that they were supposed to get. And that's why they wanted at least, that safety that if you have the mandis, the markets that were already existing, the regulated markets, then at least there you can get the minimum support price. Now they're worried that the markets will disappear over a period of time. It's not that it's going to happen tomorrow, but over a period of time, these markets may disappear, the support price may disappear, and in the free market, they may not get the price that they deserve. So they are very worried because that's been their past experience. And it's true that, various political parties, when they've been in power, they've suggested these. Even the BJP, when it was out of power, had opposed these kind of reforms. So Mr. Modi, as the Gujarat chief minister, had opposed these. Late Sushma Swaraj, late, Arun Jaitley in the parliament had, vociferously opposed these kind of changes because they said that the farmers cannot deal with the open market situation. So it seems that, depending on where the political party is, if it's in power, then it works for the corporate sector. When it's in opposition, then it works against it. So in other words, there's a lot of politics that is involved in it. And the farmers are the ones who've been suffering. They've been protesting for the last 3 years. You saw before the elections huge, demonstrations in Maharashtra. You saw huge demonstrations outside Delhi, in Madhya Pradesh, in various other parts of the country. Farmers from as far away as Chennai had come to Delhi and spent 100 days. They were doing all kinds of things like shaving off their head, taking off their clothes, etc., to draw the attention of the government. But the government was not listening to them. So now the farmers have mobilized and they say that they want at least the basic minimum. If they can't improve the situation, don't let these laws make the situation worse.
That's
what their fear is.
Let's talk about that basic minimum. Nikita, I mean, in a free market, and this is, I think, one of the biggest concerns for the farmers, these are people barely surviving on what they produce every year. And they're just concerned that in entering a new territory, they won't have the same bargaining power to negotiate with private companies, and suddenly the companies will end up being the ones dictating the terms of the market.
That's right. So the current government, in order to build a consensus around the laws, is telling us that they will free up agriculture. Farmers will be able to sell in any part of the country. They don't have to go through middlemen, and they're not dependent anymore on the agricultural produce market yards. This is a fallacy that any of this was not possible earlier. If I were a farmer and I wanted to sell at my farm gate to a private player, I could do that earlier in most states of India. I could travel from, say Uttar Pradesh in the north to Gujarat in the west. It's just that the vast majority of farmers in India have an average annual income of 20,000 rupees a year. And these are government figures. With that kind of income, you cannot put all your produce on a freight train and, carry it halfway across the country. You will be dependent on the corporate coming to you or the market coming to you. And that's where the fear lies, in the inequality in the system. And we also have to realize that the government, in talking about reform, and this reform is necessary, has a really outdated model of how structurally the economy has to move from dependence on agriculture to industry. There was this talk of the push in the economy, the big structural push by economists like Rosenstein, Rodin. This talk is from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and it got further purchased in the 1990s in the time of economic reform. This is a time when industry is growing and there is employment in industry. Now, India is at a stage where last year we had more unemployment than the last 45 years. So when there's no other alternative and we undercut the conditions that the farmers are in already, where are they going to go? So it's this outdated model of reform that is being pushed on people with no alternatives and greater power to big corporates, on which this government depends.
Tuhin, the Prime Minister says this is a politically motivated move by the opposition to hold the reform process. But when you look at the consensus that has been prevailing in India since the 60s, is that for the government to give a sense of dignity to the small farmers, there needs to be always this minimum support price, which is the MSP, to ensure that people will never be able to be manipulated by corporations. This is not what this reform is addressing, and this is why people are pretty much concerned about what happens next. And the government is not forthcoming when it comes to the MSP.
See, you need to understand that MSP does not get impacted by these three farm laws at all. MSP has existed from the 1960s, and no government in the last 55 years or so has ever tampered with the existence of MSPs. So there is no question of doing away with MSPs. No, but you also need to understand that MSP works better as an administrative mechanism than a legal instrument, because the very purpose of MSP is to tweak it at constant intervals to give the benefit to the farmers in times when there is a bumper production and they tend to get less. So the very purpose of MSP is to make it very flexible, and if it is mired in a litigious purpose, in a litigious process, that purpose will get defeated. But at the same time, we have repeatedly assured that the MSP system will continue. It will remain unaffected by this whole thing. And in any case, if you look at the facts, 80% of the farmers today sell outside the ambit of the MSP. the ones protesting as well. If you look at the protests, why we call it politically motivated, the political parties protesting in Kerala and Bihar do not even remember that in Bihar, APMC has been done away with in 2006. In Kerala, it has not existed for many years. And these are the people who are at the forefront of the protest. The Delhi CM, who tore the farm bill recently in his state assembly, was the first one to actually notify one of the farm bills on 22nd of November.
Tuhin, one of the other concerns voiced by the people is that basically with the new law, there's absolutely no way you can settle disputes in courts. You have to go to other boards, like particularly the conciliation board. And this is why people are very much concerned about the 3 laws introduced by the government.
Yeah, so, there are several kinds of issues that have been raised, and I think we need to address them. First is that MSP is not going to disappear. What will happen is it will disappear slowly as the APMC, the markets, the wholesale markets, they will weaken as, you begin to sell outside. And when you begin to sell outside, there's no guarantee that the small farmer can actually counter the lawyers of the big corporates and so on. And also, the big corporates are not going to buy from large number of small farmers. They will continue to use the present, wholesale traders, much less in number than what they exist today, but they'll be the aggregators. So in a sense, the squeeze on the small guy will be both from the corporates as well as from the traders. And outside the APMC markets, there'll be very little protection. And when you are not able to go to court, then you have to go for some kind of arbitration board. There, the lawyers will win over the small guy. He would not know what kind of contract would be signed, etc. There's also another problem that the small guys feel, and that is that they will lose their land because, the contract may be in such a way that, they would have to forego their land and become landless laborers. In a sense, if you look at what happened in 1971 census, after the Green Revolution started in 1967, large number of farmers became landless laborers. So I think a lot of fear of the farmers is that they are going to lose their land to the big guys. There'd be contract farming that would come in and they would have no voice before these people. There's another issue that I think is very important in this context, and that is the mechanization that has been taking place in agriculture. So the employment elasticity in agriculture has dropped to zero. There's so much mechanization with harvester combines and so on that new jobs are not being created. So there's what is called disguised unemployment. People are simply sitting in the farms and doing a little bit of work, and that raises costs. So in a sense, the solution to the problem lies outside the farm itself by creation of the non-farm employment. Okay. But what's happened is that investment in agriculture has declined, investment in rural areas has declined, and therefore, not enough jobs are being created and people are being pushed out into the urban areas or are forced to remain in agriculture. It still employs about 42% of the workforce, but only produces about 14% of the GDP. So its share is declining, all the time. And therefore, the people there have very low incomes, as was being said earlier. So there are a whole range of issues that relate to agriculture as well as to non-agriculture. Right. It links up not just to agriculture policy, but what kind of taxation we have, what kind of subsidy policies we have, budgetary policies. So, it's arbitration is one, but, the issue is how to improve the lot of the farmers. That, I think, is the main issue. All right. That's why farmers have been protesting even before this.
But then, Nikita, don't you think that this could be the moment to think genuinely about how to move forward? Because agriculture in India is not like in other parts of the world. It only contributes to something like 16% of the GDP. And you cannot move forward, put more investments, or ask international investors to step in without genuine, transparent reforms. Don't you think that the farmers themselves need to understand that this is a critical moment for them?
So see, the kind of questions you're asking and the kind of small concessions that the government is making now after the laws have been rammed through parliament when their own government constituents were protesting and finally resigned, these kinds of questions should have been asked a lot earlier in a cross-parliamentary committee with members of farmers' organizations consulted. None of that has happened. You spoke about worries about investor confidence and getting investment into India in all sorts of sectors, and I can see that the government genuinely wants to do that. We need to understand that one of the factors that makes India or made India attractive to companies from abroad to come and invest in India is one, its labor force, and two, the fact that India is a rising large economy with a demographic dividend, and importantly, unlike a country like China, it is democratic. When the government is reducing the democratic dividend of this country, its own citizens are restive and on the street, this is sending not a good signal to investors at all. So while the government might have reform in mind, that reform has to be pro-people reform, not pro-market reform only. And it needs to continue with the tradition of democracy that is India's, that holds India's place in the world. By cutting down that and only pushing your corporate friends, the government seems to be doing a great disservice to decades of what India has achieved.
All right. Tuhin, you said that this is good for the country. But it seems that one of the biggest problems with the Prime Minister is basically he's always confident he has enough support of the Parliament and therefore he can implement whatever reforms, laws he wants to do. But when it comes to this particular issue, people are saying no to deregulation, yes to reform of the existing laws in the country. This gives me an indication that perhaps the government did not consult with the people who are mostly affected by this particular issue, and most importantly, he didn't win the hearts and minds of the farmer unions.
If you're referring to the passage of the bill in Parliament, especially the Rajya Sabha, let me tell you that on the given day, even before the voting, which unfortunately could not take place, we had the prerequisite numbers. Unfortunately, two of the regional parties who are protesting today, Shiv Sena and NCP, both in Maharashtra, they were not part of the discussion. They walked away before the voting, much before the discussion was concluded. Rahul Gandhi, of all places, I understand he gave a personal reason for not being there. Rahul Gandhi was not a part of that discussion. But the point is that almost every political party in the past has supported these reforms. In fact, it was in the manifesto of the Congress party also. The reason why we had to push it, you need to understand that during the lockdown, we have taken an extra initiative to keep the economy moving, and the results of which are showing at this point of time. So if one of the biggest gainers in the last 6 or 8 months has been the agriculture sector recording the highest exports and the highest production, one of the reasons is that we have been in a reformist mode at a time when we could have afforded to take it easy. And mind you, these protests which are taking place right now has also only exposed once again the vast inequality that existed in the sector. It is the large landowners and the intermediaries who are largely protesting, and the protests are largely centered around 1 or 2 states. The bulk and the...
But you agree with me, if I may just say this, you agree with me this is quite significant. This is what a pivotal moment for a country. And therefore, I think the need for more debate could have been the best way out for the Prime Minister. And let me go for this particular question to Arun. When you change a law from supply-focused to demand-focused, you're changing the very structure of one of the most pivotal sectors of the economy. It could lead to glory or a disaster at the same time.
Yes. If you want to reform agriculture, you have to invest massively in rural areas. That is the main thing that has not happened after the mid-1980s. Investment in agriculture has been declining in public investment in agriculture. Let me also point out that foreign investment in India is only 5% of the total investment. Bulk of the investment is really internal, and that is what has fallen after 2012-13 from 36% now down to 28%, even less. So that is what one needs to increase, and it's not going to be foreign investment. In fact, the farmers are worried about foreign players coming in, and they'll be the big guys, and they will, dispossess large number of small farmers. So I think the real issue is what the farmers feel. Whatever the political parties may be saying, whatever they may have been saying earlier, whatever their views, even the BJP was opposing these kind of reforms when it was out of power and it was in the states. So the point really is that, can you, look at the production data and say it's really working well? It's not, because, in the pandemic, the fruits, vegetables, milk, poultry, etc., they suffered badly. That data is not available. Inequalities are very high. So I think, there are a lot of issues. Therefore, what you need is a holistic package for reform in agriculture, not just the kind of things that have been said, in the laws.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Nikita, Tuhin, Sinha, Arun, Kumar, I really appreciate your time and your insight. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.